There is a particular kind of exhaustion that has nothing to do with sleep. It settles into you after years of explaining yourself to people who were never quite willing to understand. After years of shrinking, softening, rewording, trying to make yourself legible to a world that kept returning you, marked as unclear. You may have spent a long time believing the problem was you, that you were too complicated, too sensitive, too much, or perhaps not enough, that if you could only find the right way to present yourself, the right tone, the right level of need, people would finally see you, finally stay. But there is another explanation, one that is quieter and kinder and more honest. You were not weak. You were simply not understood. And those two things, weakness and being misunderstood, feel identical from the inside. That is part of what makes this so painful and so difficult to untangle. When we are young, we have no language for the idea that the people around us might be limited in what they can see. We assume that perception is neutral, that if someone looks at us and finds us confusing or too emotional or difficult, they must be right. They are the adults. They are the ones who already know how the world works. So we do what children do. We adapt. We learn which parts of ourselves produce warmth and which produce withdrawal. We edit. We perform. We develop early and without realizing it, a kind of internal censorship, a constant monitoring of the self before it is offered to others. And we carry that monitoring into adulthood long after the original audience has gone. This is not weakness. This is intelligence applied to an unfair situation. A child learning to survive in an emotional environment that could not hold all of who they were. But intelligence applied to the wrong problem has a cost. The cost is that we become strangers to ourselves. We lose track of what we actually feel, what we actually need, what we would actually say, if we believed even briefly that saying it would be safe. The philosopher Charles Taylor wrote about what he called the politics of recognition, the idea that human beings do not simply need food and shelter, but need to be seen accurately by others in order to fully become themselves. That identity is not something we produce alone in isolation. It is something that forms in the space between people, in the quality of attention we receive, in the way others reflect us back. When that reflection is distorted, when the people closest to us were too anxious, too absent, too defended, too simply incurious to see us clearly, we do not just feel lonely. We begin to doubt the reality of our own inner life. We wonder if our sadness is real or if we are being dramatic. We wonder if our needs are legitimate or if we are being demanding. We wonder if our version of events is accurate or if we are, as we were sometimes told, too sensitive to be trusted. This is one of the most disorienting experiences a human being can have. Not to be hated, not even to be ignored, but to be slightly, persistently misread, and to have that misreading presented back to you as truth. In modern life, this wound takes on particular shapes. There is the person who has learned to be impressive rather than intimate, who discovered early that achievement opens doors that vulnerability cannot, who has built an entire life around accomplishments, precisely because accomplishments do not require the other person to understand you. They only require them to be impressed. And being impressed, they have learned, is so much more reliable than being understood. There is the person who became funny, who found that humor is a kind of translation, a way of offering your inner life in a form so palatably disguised that no one notices they are receiving something real. The joke is a gift wrapped so carefully that it looks like nothing. There is the person who became helpful, who discovered that giving is less dangerous than asking, that when you are the one attending to others, no one looks too closely at what you yourself might need. And there is the person who became quiet, who simply withdrew the parts of themselves that kept being returned. Who decided, without fully deciding somewhere between adolescence and adulthood, that the easier course was to offer less, to want less, to need less, to take up less space? None of these are weaknesses. They are adaptations. Elegant, painful, costly adaptations, but adaptations to real conditions. The problem is not that these strategies failed. The problem is that they succeeded. And now it is hard to imagine living without them. There is a particular grief in realizing as an adult that something you were told about yourself was not true. Perhaps you were told you were too emotional, that your reactions were disproportionate, that you cried too easily, felt too deeply, took things too hard. And perhaps, over time, you believed it. You learned to be suspicious of your own feelings, to manage them before they became visible, to apologize for them when they could not quite be contained. But consider the other interpretation. Consider that what was called disproportionate was simply honest, that what was called sensitive was simply perceptive, that you were not feeling too much, you were feeling accurately, in a situation where accurate feeling was inconvenient. Sensitivity is not a flaw. It is a form of intelligence. It means that the world registers in you with more resolution, more detail, more complexity. That is not something to be corrected. It is something to be eventually honored and, more importantly, protected. Because not every environment deserves that kind of openness. The mistake was not that you felt so much. The mistake, if it can even be called that, was being given so little in return. We live in a culture that is deeply uncomfortable with need. We celebrate self-sufficiency. We admire people who do not require much from others. We use the language of independence as if emotional need were a design flaw rather than a fundamental feature of being human. We have made vulnerability something to be performed on social media and avoided in real relationships. And so the person who genuinely needs, who needs to be heard, who needs to be seen, who needs consistent, attentive, patient presence tends to be cast as the problem. Too needy, too intense, too much. But need is not pathology. Need is biology. Need is the condition of having been born a social creature in a species that survives through attachment, through recognition, through the reliable presence of others. The question is never whether you needed too much. The question is whether the people around you had the capacity to give what a human being requires, and very often not because of malice, but because of their own unexamined pain, they did not. That is not a reflection of your worth. It is a reflection of their limitation. There is a moment, and for many people it comes quietly, almost without announcement, when you begin to consider the possibility that the story you have been telling about yourself might not be accurate, not dramatically wrong, not a total fabrication, but slightly crucially tilted in the wrong direction, tilted toward blame, toward self-suspicion, toward a version of yourself that is always slightly too much or slightly not enough, but never quite right. That moment of reconsideration is one of the most important things that can happen to a person. Not because it resolves everything, not because it erases the years of quiet self-doubt or the reflexive apologizing or the constant recalibration of your inner life to suit other people's comfort, but because it introduces a new possibility. The possibility that you are not, and never were, the problem. The possibility that the thing you have been trying to fix, this particular version of yourself, this sensitivity, this need, this depth of feeling was never broken to begin with. To be misunderstood by someone you love is one of the most specific and under-discussed forms of pain. It is not the pain of being unloved. It is subtler than that, and in some ways more corrosive, because at least in the absence of love, you know what you are grieving. But to be present in a relationship, to be close to someone, to share a life or a home or a conversation, and to feel beneath all of it a quiet, persistent sense that they do not quite see you. That is a different kind of loneliness entirely. It is the loneliness of the almost known. And many people live there for years. They have relationships, they have friendships, they have family, and they love these people and are loved in return. But they carry somewhere underneath the connection a faint ache, a sense that the version of themselves that is being loved is not quite complete. That something essential has been left outside the room. This is not a reason to leave. It is a reason to grieve. And grieving it, actually allowing yourself to name it, to feel it, rather than concluding once again that you are simply asking for too much, is its own small act of courage. The beginning of understanding yourself is the willingness to suspend, at least temporarily, the judgments you have inherited, to ask, what would I believe about myself if I had grown up in a different emotional climate? If the first people who shaped me had been more curious, more patient, more willing to sit with discomfort, if they had been simply more present, you do not have to romanticize a different childhood. You do not have to blame the people who raised you. Most of them were doing what they could with what they had. But you are allowed to notice what was missing. You are allowed to name it. And you are allowed, slowly and without drama, to stop treating their limitations as your definitions. You are allowed to decide, at whatever age you are now, that the story is not finished. That the person who was labeled too much, or not enough, or difficult, or sensitive, or complicated, that person has not yet been met. Not fully, not by the right kind of attention, and that the right kind of attention begins quietly and imperfectly with your own. To understand yourself is not a project you complete. It is a practice, something you return to, the way you return to sleep, not as an achievement, but as a necessity, as something the self requires in order to continue. And part of that practice is learning to distinguish between your wounds and your character, to notice which parts of you developed in response to pain, the performance, the self-sufficiency, the silence, and which parts were there before the world told you they were problems. The curiosity, the feeling, the need for depth, the refusal to be content with surfaces, those parts are not symptoms. They are you. They may have been inconvenient to certain people at certain times, but inconvenience is not the same as wrongness. And the people who found you inconvenient were not necessarily the people best equipped to know you. What you were searching for, and perhaps still are, is not so complicated. When you find the language for it, you were searching for someone who would look at the full breadth of who you are and not feel the need to edit it, who could hold your sadness without calling it excessive, your need without calling it burdensome, your questions without calling them exhausting. You were searching, in other words, for the experience of being genuinely known. That is not too much to want. That is, in fact, one of the most human things there is to want. It is the desire that drives literature and music, and the long conversations that do not end until the night is almost gone. It is the thing beneath most of what we do. And the fact that you have not yet found it, or found it only partially, only briefly, only at a cost, does not mean you asked for too much. It means you have not yet been met by someone with the capacity to offer it. That is a sad thing. It is worth grieving, but it is not, and never was, a verdict on your worth. You are not weak. You are someone who has felt deeply in a world that is often frightened of depth. Someone who has needed genuinely in a culture that mistakes need for failure. Someone who has carried for years a quiet grief at the distance between who you are and who people seem to want you to be. That grief makes sense. It is the appropriate response to a real loss, but it is not the end of the story, because understanding arrives slowly, imperfectly, and sometimes unexpectedly in a conversation. A book, a moment of unusual honesty, a person who looks at you without flinching understanding arrives. And when it does, something that has been waiting a very long time finally relaxes. Not because everything is resolved, not because the old pain disappears, but because for perhaps the first time, you are no longer alone with it. And that the simple, profound relief of being truly seen is what you deserved all along.